All right, welcome back. We are going to move into our next teaching. And I have a couple of cartoons here for you. They belong to that Christian school. And then, please, Dad, can I keep him? He's quiet, doesn't eat much, and he's worth millions in endorsement deals. So before I get started, I just want to make sure, are there any questions? Excuse me, I'm itching. Are there any questions that people might have that I can take a couple minutes to answer? I know there's a lot of information. Are you all getting overwhelmed with information? Yeah, there's so much to it. We're studying not only a religion, but we're studying the history of the religion and how it evolved. And so there's a lot to it. And I am hoping that by the time it's all done, that you will have a really good understanding, a really solid understanding about Islam that you did not have before.
I do have a question.
Yes?
Why isn't this class counted as a history class?
Why isn't this class counted as a history class? I don't know. I did not have anything to do with that. You could ask CLST headquarters to count it as a history class. It certainly has a lot of history in it. So I don't know. I don't know that answer. It's a great question for somebody else that runs the school. All right. Well, let's move on here. Looking at this first paragraph, Simba, try to say this name, Mammadovich. That's, my dad always used to make me say things like rubber baby buggy bumper and, red bug's blood, black bug's blood and all those kinds of things. So he helped me a lot. But he was a 23-year-old male who was raised Sunni Muslim but turned to Sufi Islam, which is kind of like animism, as he grew older due to visions he was having. In 1992, he encountered a Christian named Martha and asked her for a Turkish New Testament. She did not have one, but invited him to visit a Messianic, get this, a Messianic Muslim Christian fellowship. It's hard to even wrap my mind around that. But a Messianic Muslim Christian fellowship, so that he could learn more about her faith. He refused on several occasions, but finally attended. As a Muslim, Simba thought he knew all about prayer. 5 times a day, he normally prayed for himself, his family, and perhaps a close friend. These Christians were different. They were praying for many things and people, including him. Their sincere love oozed into his heart, and he could not get the meeting out of his mind. Eventually, he accepted Jesus as his Messiah. When they actually get around Christians and you're just praying for whatever the Holy Spirit lays upon your heart, it's amazing to many of them, because they don't operate that way. They have pretty much ritualistic prayers, even though they might have their small list of things they pray for. They find it quite amazing. So moving on here, the golden age of Islam. Let's say that together, the golden age of Islam. And so the golden age was pretty amazing. Now I'm going to try to give you an overview of it, look at the different angles of it, not just the positive side, but also probably the negative side, and from different perspectives, because that's how I think we learn the best. But the length of it, some would say that it went all the way from the 8th to the 13th century. I don't believe that. I think it was much shorter than that. But there were some aspects of it that were pretty amazing. You can see under letter B there in your notes, from 786 to 809, the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid ushered in the Golden Age by starting the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, in which scholars from various parts of the world were asked to translate the world's classical knowledge into Arabic. Now that's amazing. I mean, just the fact that I don't care whether he was Islamic or Buddhist or Jewish or whatever, he wanted to get wisdom. He wanted to get wisdom, and so he basically started this place, the House of Wisdom, for people coming and translating things. And a lot of good things come out of that. When people seek truth, no matter what religion they're in, truth is going to expound. and it's going to be there. When they kind of take down their defenses, they open up their hearts to something different, then truth can happen. So we have several examples here, and the first one in your notes is 1001 Arabian Nights. Now, how many of you have ever heard of that book before? 1001. We all have, right? I mean, pretty much in our culture, we've all heard of it, but how many of us have actually read it? Well, I actually want to read the very beginning of it for you. I downloaded it on Kindle, and so it's actually quite interesting. I'm going to read the beginning of it. I have, I guess, 3 slides here to go through first. So, 1001 Arabian Nights. This collection of folk tales was compiled during the golden age of Islam. It begins with the story of a brave, beautiful, and witty young woman named Scheherazade. You've probably heard that name before, Scheherazade, who risks her life to save many others. Bitter from an unfaithful wife, the Sultan takes a new virgin each night, but has her killed in the morning so that she cannot break his heart again. So this is how the whole book begins, right? Because his wife was unfaithful, so he thought, I never want that to happen again. And he had power, so he could take a virgin every single night. So Scheherazade comes up with a desperate scheme to save the lives of young women. And she asks her father, who is actually works for and with the Sultan, called the Grand Vizier, to give her to Shirar, however that's pronounced. And the Sultan, he does not want her to do it, obviously, because she's his daughter, but she keeps insisting until he finally gives in. And I'm just really giving you the ideas behind it. It's much longer than that. But finally, she enlisted the aid of her younger sister, Dinarzade. And so I'm going to begin reading here when he finally consents, her father, and he gives her, and this is kind of the way that it works. An hour before, let's see if I'm at the right place. Sorry, I'm trying to find. Okay. Okay, so sorry. An hour before daybreak, well, I don't know why I can't find it. Okay, I'll just start up here. When the usual hour arrived, the Grand Vizier conducted Scheherazade to the palace and left her alone with the Sultan, who bade her raise her veil and was amazed at her beauty. But seeing her eyes full of tears, he asked what was the matter. Sire, replied Scheherazade, I have a sister who loves me as tenderly as I love her. Grant me the favor of allowing her to sleep this night in the same room, as it is the last we shall be together, because supposedly she was going to be sacrificed in the morning, killed in the morning. The Sultan Shirar consented to Scheherazade's position, and Dinarzade was sent for. An hour before daybreak, Zenarad awoke and exclaimed, as she had promised her, because she and her sister had this kind of worked out. So she said, my dear sister, if you are not awake, tell me, I pray you, before the sun rises, one of your charming stories. It is the last time that I shall have the pleasure of hearing you. So Scheherazade did not answer her sister, but turned to the Sultan. Will your Highness permit me to do as my sister asks? Said she. Willingly, he answered. So Scheherazade began the story of the merchant and the genie. Sire, there was once upon a time a merchant who possessed great wealth in land and merchandise, as well as in ready money. He was obliged from time to time to take journeys to arrange his affairs. One day, having to go a long way from home, he mounted his horse, taking with him a small wallet in which he had put a few biscuits and dates, because he had to pass through the desert where no food was to be got. He arrived without any mishap, and having finished his business, he set out for his return. On the 4th day of this journey, the heat of the sun being very great, he turned out of the road to rest under some trees. He found at the foot of a large walnut tree a fountain of clear running water. He dismounted, fastened his horse to a branch of the tree, and sat by the fountain, having taken from his wallet some of the dates and biscuits. When he had finished the frugal meal, he washed his face and hands in the fountain. When he was thus employed, he saw an enormous genie, white with rage, coming toward him with a scimitar in his hands like a sword. "Arise," he cried in a terrible voice, "and let me kill you as you have killed my son." As he uttered these words, he gave a frightful yell. The merchant, quite as much terrified at the hideous face of the monster as his words, answered him tremblingly, "Alas, good sir, what can I have done to deserve death?" "I shall kill you," replied the genie, "as you have killed my son." "But," said the merchant, "how have I killed your son? I do not know him. I have never seen him." "When you arrived here, did you not sit on the ground?" asked the genie. "And did you not take some dates from your wallet? And while you were eating them, did you not throw stones about?" "Yes," said the merchant, "I certainly did." "Then," said the genie, "I tell you, you have killed my son. For while you were throwing about stones, my son passed by, and one of them struck him in the eye and killed him. So I shall kill you." "Ah, sir, forgive me," cried the merchant. I will have no mercy on you," answered the genie. "But I killed your son quite unintentionally, so I implore you to spare my life." "No," said the genie, "I shall kill you as you killed my son." And so saying, he seized the merchant by the arm, threw him on the ground, and lifted his saber to cut off his head. The merchant, protesting his innocence, bewailed his wife and children and tried pitifully to avert his fate. The genie, with his raised scimitar, waited till he had finished, but was not in the least touched. And then it goes on. Scheherazade, at this point, seeing that it was day, and knowing that the Sultan always rose very early to attend the council, stopped speaking. "Indeed, sister," said Dinarzade, "this is a wonderful story." "The rest is still more wonderful," replied Scheherazade, "and you would say so if the Sultan would allow me to live another day, and would give me leave to tell it to you the next night." Shirar, the Sultan, who had been listening to Scheherazade with pleasure, said to himself, "I will wait till tomorrow. I can always have her killed when I have heard the end of the story." All this time, the Grand Vizier was in a terrible state of anxiety, but he was much delighted when he saw the Sultan enter the council chamber without giving the terrible command that he was expecting, because the Sultan would say to him, "You need to go and have this woman beheaded or killed." The next morning, before the day broke, Dinarzade said to her sister, "Dear sister, if you are awake, I pray you to go on with the story." The Sultan did not wait for Scheherazade to ask his leave. "Finish," he said, "the story of the genie and the merchant. I am curious to hear the end." So Scheherazade went on with the story. This happened every morning. So what this means is that every morning she left the Sultan midway through a story, partway through a story, and so he was so anxious to hear the end of it that she lived another day. But I'm going to tell you just a little bit more of the story. So the Sultana, they called her now, told the story, and the Sultan would leave her to finish it. So she went on. When the merchant saw that the genie was determined to cut off his head, he said, "One more word, I entreat you. Grant me a little delay, just a short time to go home and bid my wife and children farewell, and to make my will. When I have done this, I will come back here, and you shall kill me." "But," said the genie, "if I grant you the delay you ask, I am afraid you will not come back." "I give you my word of honor," answered the merchant, "that I will come back without fail." "How long do you require?" asked the genie. "I ask you for a year's grace," replied the merchant. "I promise you that tomorrow, 12th month, I shall be awaiting under these trees to give myself to you." On this, the genie left him near the fountain and disappeared. The merchant, having recovered from his fright, mounted his horse and went on his road. When he arrived home, his children, his wife, received him with the greatest joy, but instead of embracing them, he began to weep so bitterly that they soon guessed that something was terribly wrong. "Tell us, I pray you," said his wife, "what has happened." "Alas," answered her husband, "I have only a year to live." Then he told them what had passed between him and the genie, and how he had given his word to return at the end of the year to be killed. When they heard this sad news, they were in despair very much and wept. The next day the merchant began to settle his affairs, and first of all to pay his debts. He gave presents to his friends, large alms to the poor. He set his slaves at liberty, and provided for his wife and children. The year soon passed away, and he was obliged to depart. When he tried to say goodbye, he was quite overcome with grief, and with difficulty tore himself away. At length he reached the place where he had first seen the genie, and on the very day that he had appointed, he dismounted and sat down on the edge of the fountain, where he awaited the genie in terrible suspense. Should I stop there? While he was thus waiting, an old man leading a hind, some kind of animal, came towards him. They greeted one another, and then the old man said to him, "May I ask, brother, what brought you to this desert place, where there are many evil genii about? To see these beautiful trees, one would imagine it was inhabited, but it is a dangerous place to stop for very long." The merchant told the old man why he was obliged to come there. He listened in astonishment. This is the most marvelous affair. I should like to be witness of your interview with the genie." So saying, he sat down by the merchant. While they were talking, another old man came up, followed by two black dogs. He greeted them and asked what they were doing in this place. The old man, who was leading the hind, told him the adventure of the merchant and the genie. The second old man had not sooner heard the story than he too decided to stay there to see what would happen. He sat down by the others and was talking. Then a third old man arrived. He asked why the merchant who was with them looked so sad. They told him the story, and he also resolved to see what would happen, what would pass between the genie and the merchant. So waited all of them there. They soon saw in the distance a thick smoke like a cloud of dust. This smoke came nearer and nearer, and then all at once it vanished, and they saw the genie, who without speaking to them approached the merchant, sword in his hand, and taking him by the arm, said, "Get up and let me kill you as you killed my son." The merchant and the three old men began to weep and groan. Then the old man, leading the hind, threw himself at the monster's feet and said, "O prince of the genii, I beg you to stay your fury and listen to me. I am going to tell you my story, and that of the hind I have with me. And if you find it more marvelous than that of the merchant whom you are about to kill, I hope that you will do away with a third part of his punishment." The genie considered some time, and then he said, "Very well, I agree to this." And so it goes on and on and on and on and on for 1,001 nights of all of these stories that come. So there are some pretty amazing things, even in the annals of literature that come to us from that time in history. You can get that book. It's available. We also see Al-Sufi. He lived from 903 to 986. He was born near Tehran. He wrote on astrology, astronomy, alchemy, and mathematics. Back in those days, they didn't, there was not so much difference between what today we call astrology and astronomy. But he created a star atlas confirming and cataloging pre-Islamic constellations. This included those by the scientist Ptolemy, very famous, who also mentioned the astronomical concept of the nebula, like the Andromeda Nebula. So this guy, Al-Sufi, was pretty amazing when it came to understanding the space and stars and everything else. He would track them. And then you have Rhasis, the physician, Al-Razi, that he was known, became the first to describe smallpox, the plague, and other infectious diseases. And then under number 4, you have Avicenna. They made a movie about him a few years ago, in 2013, the movie called The Physician. Any of you see that movie? It was pretty amazing. It was well done. He was described as the father of early modern medicine. He wrote 40 works on medicine as well as 150 on philosophy. So You know, there were philosophers, there were medical people, there were scientists, there was literature, people that were writing literature. All of this was emerging during the golden age of Islam, which was pretty amazing. Now, what is often overlooked is the contribution that came in from Christianity. You know, a lot of times people talk about the golden age of Islam, but where did all of that actually come from? Did they invent all of that, or were they building upon other people's works? Well, I contend that they were building upon other people's works. For instance, Charlemagne, who ruled or lived from 742 to 814, or also known as Charles the Great, was the king of the Franks, of that Germany area at that time, for quite a season of time. And he was the emperor of the West also for a long time. So he kind of was over the entire empire, just like Constantine had been a long time before him. He founded the Holy Roman Empire, stimulated European economic and political life, and fostered the cultural revival known as the Carolingian Renaissance. And so it was the Christian Emperor Charlemagne. Emperor Charlemagne is what you write in your notes there, who brought scholars together to translate and preserve the classical works in Latin. In fact, most of the surviving works of classical Latin were copied and preserved by Carolingian scholars. They were so widespread that they survived the Viking invasions. So Charlemagne, some of his accomplishments, he led the Franks in building a huge empire. The Pope crowned Charlemagne the king of the Holy Roman Empire. I think it was on Christmas Day in 800 AD, if I remember right. He was a great administrator of schools. He started all kinds of schools. He was really into education. And scholars were brought in during his reign to teach in his kingdom. He wanted people that were good at all the languages and that would translate all of the scholarly works. And so this is happening just prior, actually just right before the supposed golden age of the Islam. And so if you look at number 2 on your notes there, when Islam spread through the Near East, Greek-speaking Christians fell within its sphere of influence. They retained their religious beliefs and there continued to be scholars with facility in both Greek and Syriac. So when the Abbasid caliphs and other wealthy patrons of the 8th through the 10th centuries decided to have Greek scientific works rendered into Arabic, most of the translators they hired were Christians. This activity was centered in Iraq and particularly Baghdad, the new capital city founded by the early Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur. And so, you know, we see Christian influence. There was also Jewish influence. Moses Maimonides, who is now known as the father of modern Judaism, was born in Cordoba, Spain, and he died in Cairo, Egypt. He influenced all of these different religions. He influenced the Jewish, the Christian, the Islamic scholars. In his book called The Guide for the Perplexed, he comes up with a 6-point refutation of Aristotle. Now, Aristotle had said that Aristotle believed in God. He said that there was a great mover. So, you know, when you think of Aristotle, think of Socrates, then Plato, then Aristotle. You know, all three of them believed in some kind of supreme being. It would appear in their writings. And Plato came up with the Republic, which talks about, you know, a supreme good God that basically rules over all men and people have to be righteous and things like that. And it's called the Logos, by the way. And so, but then that was 500 years before the New Testament happened. But we see that Aristotle, he might not have been put it the same way that like Socrates did or as Plato did, but he believed in the unmoved mover. Basically that there was, you know, something started everything, and that was the unmoved mover. And so basically that was God. But he made a mistake in his ideas about the universe, because Aristotle said that the universe has always been here, Earth has always been here, and God has always been here. Always, 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 throughout all eternity. So Maimonides took him on, And I read his book. It's an amazing, amazing book. And he comes up with a refutation, a 6-point refutation of Aristotle. Of course, he, and talks about the Jewish God and the God of the Bible and everything else. And he believes he proves that. Well, what is so interesting is that his influence, Maimonides' influence, went far and wide to the point where 100 years later, it was Thomas Aquinas who picked up the 6 points of Maimonides, and he used that then, proving the Christian God, but basically refuting Aristotle as well. And so, very, very interesting. If you ever want to read a great book, and you like philosophy, get the Guide for the Perplexed. If you ever want a first-class look at the book of Job, for instance, he was the Hebrew of Hebrew scholars, and it's not all about Job, but there's a portion in there that's like, whoa, this is amazing. Okay, moving on. So we have the under letter E, what's called the Convivencia. And it was a Spanish term that meant living together. It was the idea of Muslims, Christians, and Jews living together in harmony. So there was certainly this concept that all three should live together in harmony. Now today, the only place where you see Christians, Jews, and Muslims living together really in so much harmony is in the old city of Jerusalem, because it's broken up into the 4 quarters there. You have the Jewish quarter, you have the Christian quarter, you have the Islamic quarter, but then you have the Armenian quarter, which is actually Christian. So we get like 50%, praise God. But basically, you see them living together in harmony in that place. And then there's this term called the Mozarabs, which refer to Christians living under the Moorish rule. Moorish would be Spanish rule of that time, the Mozarabs. And so the golden age was really not so golden according to letter G. There was mistreatment. The Mozarabs of Al-Andalus, which is a part of Spain, just like the Copts of Egypt, were treated as second-class citizens and often lived in demoralizing conditions. There were martyrs. Numerous Christian martyrs were reported in the 9th century Cordoba. Persecutions of Al-Mazur and Al-Malik blazed against the Christians in the 10th century. The Jews of Granada were massacred in the 11th century, and numerous Christians were deported to Morocco in the 12th century. And there was also limited scholarship. It was really just for the elite. There was a small percentage in the princely court, so it wasn't really widespread like it would come across. The Jews and the Mozarabs, once again, those Christians that were living under their rule, were prohibited from flourishing, and the later lost any intellectual initiative. For instance, Yehuda, one of the Jewish poets who was a Zionist, his poems were all about going back to Jerusalem. So yeah, he became very famous and very intellectual and everything else, but in his heart, all of his poetry came out of his persecution. Now that happens at times in the world. Sometimes persecution causes the best artists, I hate to say. Sometimes it causes probably the best writers, Solzhenitsyn in Russia, so to speak. You just have persecution causes things. And Maimonides' family fled from Cordoba to Morocco, Palestine, and Cairo because of the religious persecution. So some believing that during the golden age of Moorish Spain, Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived together in harmony within a tolerant and enlightened and upwardly mobile culture. But conversely, however, it was the fragmentation of that society and the jihadist spirit that spurred on the crusading Reconquista, the reconquering of Spain by Christians. So when you look at this first map here, you see in the green, this part of Spain, all of it belongs to basically the Abbasid dynasty. It was all a part of it. And you can see some of the kingdoms in the north, the Kingdom of France, and they were inhabited by and influenced by Europeans. But eventually, everything broke apart, and you see how all of this became just fragmented in there, so that eventually the Christians were able to come back in. What they call the Reconquista began, the reconquering of Spain by the Christians. So it broke up. Okay, so now moving into the Crusades. Moving into the Crusades. Before the Middle Ages, Christendom had no well-defined concept of holy war, as did Islam. Christianity had preached a peace not yet achieved. Christian Rome's central control destabilized as it dealt with paganism and further invasions by barbarians. These wars obliterated any hope of peaceful, pacific development and produced feudal Christian states with warrior ethos. By the 10th century, there was an emergence of French chivalry and the belief that the Christian knight who died in battle for the faith was both hero and martyr. So suddenly, the parts of Europe were becoming prepared for battle. The military expansion of Islam sparked the crusading spirit in Christian feudal states that had been created by war and for war. Say that with me, by war and for war. So you had these feudal states that were broken up, and they were kind of warring with one another somewhat, over power, even inside of Europe. But Islam's progressive conquest over the centuries and its internal rivalries invaded the physical security of Europe, fashioned both spiritual alarm about the Holy Land and drew forth armed retaliation. So a crusading spirit arose among Christians against the spirit of militant jihad. Okay, so the Islamic worldview, once again, everything inside of Islam is called Dar al-Islam. Say that with me, Dar al-Islam. And then everything outside of it is called Dar al-Harb. Once again, say that with me, Dar al-Harb. D-A-R-A-L-H-A-R-B. So inside of Islam, it's supposed to be peaceful. Outside of Islam, it's the house of war. Everything inside peaceful, everything outside house of war. Even though everything inside was not so peaceful. Let's face it, they were warring with each other back and forth, just as much as anybody was in Europe. Okay. And then the thing that probably really tipped the scales and started the Crusades was when the Seljuk Turk family converted and then they spread Islam. They took over Jerusalem. And what had happened prior to that, the Muslims that were in charge of Jerusalem had allowed the Christians to come on pilgrimages to Jerusalem. They liked the fact that Christians would come and spend money there, and so they would have markets and things like that. And so, of course, the Christians wanted to come on a spiritual pilgrimage to Jerusalem, just like people like to today, and they would spend their money, and so everybody was happy, Well, the Seljuk Turks, not so much. They didn't want the Christians coming there. So they would kidnap them, ransom them for money, they would kill them, and all kinds of bad reports were coming back to Europe at that time. So that's one thing. There was also, let me say this, there was also the fact that Europe was every year having the Islamic marauders come against them. And I just want you to put yourself now kind of in their spots, okay? I'm not defending all of the actions of what happened during the Crusades. What I am trying to do here is to say that 1,000 years later, we should be careful about judging an entire people group for an action that they took place way back then. We weren't at that time. We don't know what was happening. So I'm trying to give you some ideas of what was happening at that time. First of all, only 3% of the population could read. So that would mean 3% of them were reading the Bible. If even that many actually had the ability to read the Bible for themselves. Besides that, every single year, the Islamic marauders would come. They would take a little bit more ground from the Europeans, and they would take their houses. They would, do terrible things to their women. They would steal their children and their women and their young men who became known as Janissaries, and they would take them into captivity. They would make them slaves. And so finally it got to a point where it was like, enough is enough. And so the First Crusade was called the People's Crusade. The People's Crusade. And it started in 1096. Basically, it was ushered in by this guy, Pope Urban II, from Cluny, and he made a famous speech at the Council of Clermont in 1095, and it ignited a passion for the First Crusade. And basically his speech was about going and rescuing Jerusalem, and we just cannot put up with this tyranny year after year after year. What are we going to do? So it must have been a pretty compelling speech, because it caused upwards to 150,000 people. Now just think about this. It's hard to even imagine, and we don't know if that's the exact number. Nobody has an exact count. It was a minimum of 40 to 50,000, and it went upwards from there. So maybe it was 100,000, maybe it was 125,000, or maybe it was more than 150,000. But basically, men, women, and knights and all kinds of people responded to this. And, long story short, they marched 2,000 miles and they took Jerusalem back from Muslims. And it was a bloody war. There were many people killed. The Jews were massacred. There was terrible things that happened, but it was a war. Steve Russellman, in his book, The First Crusade, puts it this way. Medieval man was convinced that the second coming was at hand. He must repent while there was time and must go out to do good. The church taught that sin could be expiated by pilgrimage. By the way, let me just say this. I wrote a book one time called Servants of the Third Watch, because I believe that we have entered into what the Bible calls the third watch, the midnight hour of the third watch. But just understand that every single generation of Christians that has ever lived has thought that Jesus was coming back in their lifetime. Just realize that. Now, we have entered into the third watch, which is pretty significant, but it's a significant time in history. But, whether it happens in our lifetime or not, just realize that. They believed it back then. He goes on and he says, and prophecies declared that the Holy Land must be recovered for the faith before Christ could come again. Further, to ignorant minds, the distinction between Jerusalem and the New Jerusalem was not very clearly defined. And so it's like, we're going to New Jerusalem here. And once again, it was the priests, it was the people that could read the Bible that were preaching the messages. And, and a lot of it was in a language that the people couldn't even understand. A lot of the rituals were done that way. There was this guy named Peter the Hermit, which played a very interesting role in the First Crusade. He preached across Europe about the Crusade, and he moved many listeners. I guess he was a good preacher. He raised his own army of French and German people. And though he was enthusiastic and hopeful of victory, his army did not succeed and was literally virtually wiped out on his way to Jerusalem, but he survived to enter Jerusalem with another army. Once again, it was a bloody war. I mean, people died on both sides of this equation in a lot of ways. And then we see Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse. He was by far the most powerful magnate to take up the cross. This 55-year-old warrior had spent most of his life extending his power over 13 counties in southern France. This is from Thomas Madden, A Concise History of the Crusades. He goes on. He was moved by the preaching of the crusade. Raymond decided to finish his life in service to God. He divested himself of all of his properties, and with his wife prepared for the departure to the east. So these guys were taking their families with them. They were taking their wives with them, and so that's the way it worked. Now, one of the things that was taken there, you see this under number 5, they conquered not only Jerusalem, but this place called Acre. It's also known as Akko, A-K-K-O, and it became the Crusaders' main port. This was significant to them. Now you can see the fortress city here. This is a modern picture of it. Well, one of the amazing things, if you ever get to go to Israel, be sure to go to Acre, because it is an amazing fortress city of that time that the Crusaders built. And underneath it, they had these secret tunnels that you can go in. And so basically it went all over the place. But today, like if you're a guy, you have a hard time going through there because, you know, people were shorter back then. And so all of the tunnels are really short, and they had armor on when they would have been going through these things. So it's kind of interesting. And they would have been knights with all this heavy armor on so basically, here's a map of the First Crusade, and you can see that, you know, they started off, obviously, you see Paris up there, and Lyon, France, and Raymond of Toulouse from over there, and basically and Godfrey of Bouillon, I guess it's pronounced, you know, they all played significant roles in the First Crusade. They brought their forces, and they converged in Nicaea, and then basically they went on from there to Edessa, Antioch, and down to Jerusalem, and they took it by storm when they finally got there. And you know, many people died. It's very sad. And so yeah, that was the First Crusade. I'm going to jump for sake of time here to the Third Crusade, and you can read about the second one, and in the book you can read about that. But the Third Crusade was led by Richard I, called King Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick I. And now, on the other side of the equation, the renowned Muslim leader Saladin, please say that, Saladin. The Sultan of Egypt had defeated the Crusaders at the famous Battle of Hattin, I think that's how it's pronounced, in 1187, recapturing Jerusalem. So he took it back, and the Crusaders actually never did get Jerusalem back. This sparked the Third Crusade. And this Saladin was really famous, and he was really well respected, even by both sides. He wasn't ruthless like so many of the Islamic leaders were. He was probably more peace-loving, but he didn't like the fact that, you know, the Crusaders had taken land and everything else, so he was taking it back. He had a lot of kind things to say about King Richard the Lionhearted. He thought he was such a brave man. And I don't have it in the notes here or even in the slides, but I've read many books on the subject, and basically he looked down on the battle one day and he saw Richard out there, Richard the Lionhearted, just taking on like 5 guys at once, you know, and he was just so amazed by King Richard that he had nothing but accolades to say for the guy. So anyway, yeah. He also captured the last portion, unfortunately, of the true cross of Christ in the battle. Now, the true cross of Christ had been around for a very long time. I have that in, you know, when I teach on the history of the early church, I talk all the way through that. But basically, it had been around, and part of it had been there in Jerusalem, and it was left there. Well, they took it out in the battle because the Christians thought that it would be a victorious sign. Well, unfortunately, it was not, and it was lost in the battle. So King Richard I made a truce with Saladin. The success of the Crusaders in the Holy Land depended upon Muslim disunity. Muslim fragmentation ceased in 1150 when Nur ud-Din and Saladin united the Islamic countries of the Middle East. And so all of a sudden, you know, the Crusaders were thinking, okay, they're just united, let's go and attack them. But then they united before that happened, so it was a crushing blow to the Crusaders. In 1187, Saladin crushed the Crusaders at the Battle of Hattin, they say here. It's Hattin and others. King Richard's departure from the Holy Land in October 1192 ended the third major Western invasion of the East. The major task of the crusade remained undone. Nonetheless, one positive achievement of this crusade, albeit modest, was reestablishing a tiny Latin kingdom of on the Palestinian coast. Okay, the Fourth Crusade, we jump to there. It was led by Fulk of Nuel, and the aim was to weaken Egypt by attacking it before recapturing Jerusalem. Number 3, however, the lack of finances forced the Crusades off course, and after confusion and arguing, many of them were misguided. And this is one of the most terrible parts of the entire crusade time. They ended up getting in a big fight and confused, and they lacked money, and so they ended up fighting other Christians. They went to Constantinople, which was a Christian city, and they wanted a lot of things from Constantinople that Constantinople would not give them, so they attacked it, and they ended up taking the city. And so they sacked the Christian city of Constantinople. And then this was eventually justified for several reasons. And most Europeans thought that this was God's vengeance on the Greeks, which were in the east, Constantinople, for not aiding the fight in the Holy Lands, because they hadn't had anything really to do with it. So under letter C, this drove a wedge of rivalry between the Eastern Byzantine Church and the Western Latin Church that would never recover. So today in Christianity, you have three major parts of Christianity. You have the Catholics in the west of Europe, so to speak. Of course, they're all over the world, but just imagine 1600 AD or 1700 AD or 1800 AD, just a few hundred years ago. You have the Catholics with the center in Rome. You had Constantinople or the Greek East, if you will. So you have the Catholics, the Greek Orthodox, and the Protestants, basically, in the world. Those three great branches of Christianity. And we're all Protestants, I believe, here. So basically, that's kind of the way it broke out after Martin Luther's thing in 1517. But at this time, Constantinople was a Christian city, and they sacked it. And then there was the Fifth Crusade. The most notable thing about that I want you to take away is that this is where we see the emergence of Francis of Assisi. I don't know if you've ever watched movies about him or read books about him. He was quite a remarkable individual. And he basically took a vow of poverty and he served the Lord in that way. It started the entire Catholic part of the Franciscan monasteries and people that would go out as monks and do charitable works all over the world. Very noble causes that went forth. I've read a book on his life one time, and if you can believe what you read, he had it going on with animals. I mean, they were so friendly with him. They would just come right up to him, and it says that he preached to the animals. It's kind of hard to believe, but he was a lover of nature, and so he was an amazing individual. Well, he went down and he preached to one of the sultans. He just took it upon himself. He was like a missionary to them. And then in some of the other crusades, you can read through those on your own, but you have a Raymond Lull, who this guy was really significant. I want to read the notes on him. From 1232 to 1314, he tried to convince European leaders that missionaries would convert the world by preaching. Amen. He opened a training center in 1276 to send missionaries to evangelize the Muslims of North Africa. Now that was really forward thinking back then. Notice what he was going to do. Just think about him as compared to modern schools of, say, trying to meet Islamic needs today. Number one, the schools would emphasize comprehensive knowledge of Arabic. That's probably a pretty good thing to do if you're going to go into Arabic-speaking countries. Number two, a deep understanding of Islamic literature to refute Muslims, to be able to refute Muslims. And number three, the commitment to be a witness for Christ. So he himself went 3 times to Northern Africa and was martyred in his 80s while preaching for Christ. Now, it is said of him that he never led one Muslim to the Lord in his life. So think about this. He went his entire life going to Northern Africa all those times, and he died on the streets. I don't want to say which community it was because I might get it wrong, but it was somewhere in Algeria, I believe. And now I tried to verify this. I read it in a book, and so I'm just telling you this kind of loosely because I'm not sure about the source evidence behind this, but I do really respect the author. I'm not going to give the author any of that kind of data. But apparently in the 1980s, in the very city where he was martyred all of those centuries before, in one night, hundreds of Muslims had a dream about Jesus, which led to a kind of a mass conversion in that community. And so, the blood of the martyrs, You know, Tertullian way back in the early church said, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of faith. And so it went forward. And here's the Mughal Empire. This is a place in Pakistan, northern India, in Lahore actually. I've been in this place. It's a gigantic mosque, and they were just all over the place. They built these huge mosques. This was built in 671. You have the Ottoman Empire, and it fell. It actually took out, unfortunately, the Constantinople. So in 1453, Constantinople fell to it, where they came with 50 to 80,000 Ottoman in a 53-day siege, and they used gunpowder and cannons and everything else. Now, one thing they also used were these people known as the Janissaries. You can see that word there, Janissaries, that you write in your notes. It's Janissaries. These were Christians when they were children, boys, who had been stolen from the Europeans or others that were Christians, and then they were trained in the ways of Islam and as warriors, to be like assassin warriors. And so they were trained in all of the arts and forms. So they took Constantinople, and today it is modern Turkey. In modern Turkey, it is Istanbul, Turkey. Okay, let's take a break now, 10-minute break, and we will come back.